Quanah Parker, the son of a war chief and a white captive, the first and only principal chief of the Comanche Nation, and one of the last of the wild Comanche to finally surrender. He spent his entire early life both preparing for and engaging in war, raiding at will and striking fear into the hearts of his enemies. Later, he'd walk the path of his mother's people, growing rich at times and successfully lobbying and negotiating on behalf of his beloved Comanche. What was it that made Quanah both a skilled fighter and an effective leader? What compelled his people to not only follow him on the warpath, but also the path of progress? Join me as we delve deep on this topic on this newest episode of Bloody Beaver Podcast. Hey, what's up, y'all? My name's Josh. Welcome to my podcast. Today, we're talking about the very awesome Quanah Parker. I got a lot of info to share, so let's just go ahead and get started. To really understand who Quanah was, you really need to understand the culture that he was raised in and the volatile environment that he and his people found themselves in at that time. To understand that, I think you'll have to be at least a little bit familiar with the history of the Comanche people and just how they ended up clashing with the Texans. It goes back a little ways. After the New World was, quote, discovered, the Spanish landed in present-day Mexico. And between 1519 and 1532, they defeated the mighty Aztec, Mayan, and Incan civilizations. The conquistadors were truly amazed by what they found. Immense wealth in gold and silver, complex cities rivaling or surpassing those in Europe, and remarkable artistic and scientific achievements. And they immediately knew they must fucking destroy it. Those natives that weren't killed in battle or decimated by diseases such as smallpox and malaria were enslaved. For their own good. Millions were killed. It was definitely a genocide. After conquering present-day Mexico, the Spanish moved north into what would become California, New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas. Now, take California, for example. The Spanish set up a series of forts and systematically enslaved all of the local natives. Again, for their own good, winning souls for the Lord one slave at a time. In Texas, however, they ran into a major roadblock. They encountered a new tribe, one that wouldn't be defeated so easily, in a harsh land unlike any they'd seen thus far. These people who called themselves Nermina, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, or, in their language, Nermina meant the people. They were known by other tribes as Comanche. And Comanche roughly translates into people who want to fight all the time. And fight they did, stopping the Spanish exploitation of Texas dead ass cold. While the Spanish would establish some missions in Texas, it was nothing like they did in California or Mexico. And none of these missions or forts were established in Comanche territory. Neither the Spanish, nor the Mexican, nor the Texas governments would ever be successful in encroaching on or defeating these lords of the Southern Plains on their own territory. So what the hell made the Comanche so ferocious? Why were they so hard to conquer? Part of it was horses. Before the arrival of horses in the Americas, all native tribes were on foot, obviously. But once they acquired horses, everything changed. They were able to move out into the Great Plains of the central United States and effectively hunt the buffalo. The Comanche were actually an offshoot of the Shoshone tribe. Before the introduction of the horse, they were a mountain people out of present-day Wyoming. Just your typical primitive hunter-gatherers. They used primitive tools, stone weapons, stuff like that, living off whatever they could. If and when they were able to eat buffalo, it was either by setting the prairie on fire or stampeding them and running them off of cliffs. They moved their villages and gear on dog travois, basically a frame slung between two poles attached and drugged by dogs. And yes, as a Texan, I do reserve the right to use the word drug as a verb. Even by primitive hunter-gatherer standards, the Comanche were remarkably simple. They practiced no agriculture that I'm aware of. They had no great warrior societies or priest classes like other tribes did. The Aztec to the south, they had a stunning civilization. They created large cities built around maize agriculture, led by priest chiefs. And then to the east, you had tribes like the Omaha and the Pawnee, with their semi-permanent dome homes, their pottery, their intricate basket making. The Comanche practiced none of these skills, and to make matters worse, all evidence suggests that they probably weren't even that great at warfare, having been driven to eking out an existence in the mountains by more highly skilled tribes. According to author S.C. Gwynn, what happened to the tribe between roughly 1625 and 1750 was one of the great social and military transformations in history. Few nations have ever progressed with such breathtaking speed from the status of skulking pariah to dominant power. The change was total and irrevocable, and it was accompanied by a complete reordering of the power on the American plains. The tribes that had once driven the Comanche to the mountains of Wyoming would soon be either dim memories, like the Kansas, Omaha, and Missouri tribes, or like the Apache Utes and Osages, retreating to avoid extermination. What brought on this amazing change? Like I said, it was the introduction of the horse, or more precisely, what the Comanche were able to do with the horse. The Spanish brought horses with them and they flourished in Mexico. Large haciendas specialized in horse breeding. After defeating and enslaving the Pueblo people of present-day New Mexico, the Spaniards used them to care and tend their horse herds. Another tribe in New Mexico, the Apache, soon took to stealing these horses, and they learned how to ride them, probably by watching the Spanish. According to Spanish records, the first mounted Apache raid occurred as early as the 1650s, but the Apache would never become like a really great horse tribe. From what I've read, they didn't fight on horseback, and they never really learned how to breed them effectively. The Pueblo ended up revolting against the Spanish in 1680, and they drove the Spanish out of New Mexico, and they themselves reverted back to their cultural ways, thus bringing upon what's known as the Great Horse Dispersal. Abandoned by the Spanish and the Pueblo having no real interest in them, thousands of Mustangs ran wild. They thrived and multiplied, thus becoming the foundation stock for the great Mustang herds of the Southwest. These horses, for the Native Americans, once they got their hands on them, permanently altered the power structures of North America. And it happened fast as fuck. In 1630, no tribes anywhere were mounted. By 1700, all Texas Plains tribes had them. By 1750, tribes as far north as the Canadian Plains were fighting and hunting on horseback. This changed everything. No longer relying on dog sleds, they were able to move permanently onto the Great Plains. They could travel great distances, hunt buffalo more efficiently, and fight much more effectively. Warriors on foot don't stand a chance against those who are mounted. There's no way to know for certain, but during all this, the Comanche probably experienced their transformation sometime around 1650. And nobody can know exactly what it was that made these people such proficient horsemen in such a small amount of time. For whatever reason, the Comanche became the horse tribe of North America. They were one of the few tribes that actually fought fully mounted. Most other tribes would actually ride to battle, then dismount to fight. And the horse was the wealth of this tribe. One warrior could own 100 to 200 horses, or a chief as many as 1,500. By comparison, a Sioux chief might only own 40 or so horses. George Catlin, a painter who traveled extensively through the American West in the 1830s, once said of the Comanche, quote, "On their feet, they are one of the most unattractive and slovenly looking race of Indians I have ever seen. But the moment they mount their horses, they seem at once metamorphosed. I am ready without hesitation to pronounce the Comanche the most extraordinary horseman I have yet seen in all of my travels." So there you have it. The Comanche became the undisputed horse champions of the New World. I also want to point out just what a Comanche warrior was capable of doing while on horseback. They could swing their bodies over the side of their horse, basically using the horse's body as a screen from enemy weapons, with just their heels hanging off the horse's back. And from this ridiculous, almost impossible sounding position, they were able to let loose as many as 20 arrows in the time it took a soldier to load and fire just one round from their muskets. Children were given their own horses at the age of 4 or 5, and as they grew older, they learned how to do tricks, such as picking up objects on the ground at full gallop. Starting with light objects, they'd move on to progressively heavier objects until finally, without any assistance and at a full gallop, be able to pick up a man, a fucking man, thus allowing them to rescue a fallen comrade during battle. These are bad motherfuckers, plain and simple. And it was into this culture of badassery that Quanah Parker was born, probably in 1848. And just one more thing about horses. When we think about the stereotypical Native American warrior, we obviously picture them on horseback, like dancing with wolves, living on the prairie, hunting buffalo. But that way of life was so short-lived. Only about 200 years compared to about 15,000 years on foot. I don't know why, I just find that interesting. Anyway, Quanah was only half Comanche. His father was a chief by the name of Peta Nakona, and his mother, Cynthia Ann Parker, was a white captive. Having been taken in a raid at the age of 9, she was eventually adopted into the Comanche tribe and fully embraced their culture. If I didn't bore you enough with all that horse talk, I'm now going to talk about Cynthia Ann's family and just how they came to be in a position to have the Comanche attack them. Because Quanah's story is really a tale of two peoples. He was half white and half native. A great clash of civilizations made him who he was, and continued to shape him and his people long after the Indian Wars were over. Mexico gained their independence and severed ties with Spain in 1821. In 1824, they enacted the General Colonization Law, which enabled all heads of household, regardless of race or immigrant status, to claim land in Mexico, which Texas was then a part of. The Mexican government had neither the manpower nor the funds to protect settlers from Comanche raids, in the hope that getting more settlers into the area could sort of help control, the fucking raids. According to our current news cycle, this is kind of ironic, but Mexico liberalized their immigration policies, thus allowing for settlers from the United States to immigrate to Texas. And that they did. Stephen fucking Austin brought a group of settlers known as the Old 300 and settled them on the Brazos River in the present-day college town of Nacogdoches. In less than 10 years, these U.S. immigrants decided to sever ties with Mexico, as Mexico had previously done with Spain, Texas, now declaring itself a sovereign nation, opened the floodgates of migration. And it was during this tumultuous time that the Parker clan moved to Texas. John Parker, veteran of the American Revolution and numerous Indian wars back east, negotiated with local tribes and finally settled on the headwaters of the Navasota River, not far from present-day Groesbeck, Texas. Groesbeck is just east of Waco, and not that far north of College Station. But in 1834, when Parker settled there, it was definitely deep in the heart of the frontier. And this fact wasn't lost on Old Man Parker. They not only built cabins, but a fort as well. The 12-foot-tall outer walls of the cabin enclosed 4 acres and were part of a surrounding stockade, perforated with loopholes for defense. Kind of like that cabin in the movie Outlaw Josie Wells, just enabling them to shoot their rifles out of the ports and fire from the safety of cover. The Parkers obviously knew their shit, at least enough to take precautions of negotiating with local tribes, like I said before, and the foresight to erect a fort. But what they didn't know was the full extent of the Comanche danger, how far they could raid, and how deadly effective they were at warfare. Just to put into perspective how cut off from civilization the Parkers were, there was no civilization west of them. None. Between their location in East Texas and California, the only settlement was Santa Fe, New Mexico, other than really the small village of San Antonio. And then to the north were the native-dominated plains. The Oregon Trail didn't even exist yet. Texas only had a population of 40,000 people at this time, and the Parkers were on the absolute fringe of the frontier, living in a fucking fort. Can you imagine living in a place so dangerous that you have to have holes cut in your walls in which to shoot a rifle through? And when you did leave the fragile safety of your fort, you had to carry a gun. When I'm not pretending to be a podcaster, I'm a machine operator. And I can't imagine having to be armed to the teeth while doing so, constantly on the lookout for a superior fighting force that not only desperately wants to end my existence in the most brutal way possible, but can easily do so whenever the fuck they desire. And such a life as that the Parkers chose to live. They were both extremely brave and extremely optimistic, and maybe a little too naive. This was obviously a recipe for disaster. And that disaster struck on the morning of May 19th, 1836. 10 of the 16 able-bodied men were out working in the fields. The 8 women and 9 children were inside the fort, but for some unfathomable reason, the gate had been left wide open. And even worse, the men who stayed at the fort were unarmed. And this I just don't understand. I guess it comes down to complacency. You get comfortable. Nothing bad's happened yet. Everything's going good. So you get lazy. You get complacent. It starts off small. Maybe you don't always keep your rifle within arm's reach. Before you know it, you're not walking around armed at all. Whatever the reason, and I'm not even sure it would have even mattered, the Parker plan was definitely caught with their fucking pants down. Before the inhabitants of the fort knew it, they were approached by at least 100 Comanche and Kiowa warriors. Unarmed and gate open, the men of the fort already knew they were dead. Their only hope was to buy enough time for the women and children to escape out the back. And what happened next is a tale rife with not only courage, but tragedy, horror, and brutality of the worst kind imaginable. If you have a sensitive disposition, stop listening now. I'm not going to sugarcoat these events. I want to lay them out raw so you'll have a decent idea of what life was like before we were all so tame and civilized. 78-year-old family patriarch John Parker led his elderly wife and other women out the back gate as the massacre began. Inside the fort, Silas Parker was rushing for his weapon as his brother Benjamin was being impaled by Comanche lances. He was clubbed, riddled with arrows, and scalped while still alive. Rachel Plummer, a niece of Benjamin and Silas, was clubbed and dragged out of the fort by her hair, then beaten some more. The men remaining in the fort, Silas Parker and Samuel and Robert Frost, were quickly killed and scalped. Meanwhile, the warriors caught up with Old Man Parker, his wife and daughter. All 3 were stripped of their clothing, and the 2 ladies were forced to watch elder John Parker being hacked to pieces by tomahawks. He was scalped and had his genitals cut off while he was still alive. Granny Parker was then pinned to the ground by their lances and raped, finally driving a knife deep into her breast and leaving her for dead. The lone survivor, Elizabeth Kellogg, was thrown on a horse and taken as captive. Silas Parker's wife, Lucy, was able to escape with 4 children, and she too was overran. 2 of her children were rescued by the armed men who were working down in the cornfields, but the Comanche were able to take off with the remaining 2. Silas and Lucy Parker's blue-eyed 9-year-old daughter, Cynthia Ann, and her brother, 7-year-old John Richard Parker. The battle lasted less than 30 minutes and left 5 men dead. 2 women were wounded. Miraculously, Granny Parker had survived her violent rape and assault. The Comanche were able to take 2 women and 3 children captive. I already mentioned Cynthia Ann, her brother John, and Elizabeth Kellogg. Also amongst the captives were Rachel Parker Plummer and her toddler son. After killing the Parker's cattle and looting the place, they torched it and headed back home with the captives in tow. I know this podcast is about Quanah Parker, and I've scarcely even mentioned the man thus far. But all this backstory, all this violence, it's necessary to understand who he was and where he came from, and what caused him to fight and live his life in the way he did. The Comanche were ferocious. They didn't exactly have the same moral compass we have nowadays. I'll give you another example of savagery. In 1870, 7 men were killed in what was known as the Salt Creek Massacre. A witness to the aftermath said that all victims were stripped, scalped, and mutilated. Some had been beheaded, and others had their brains scooped out. Robert G. Carter was quoted as saying, quote, "Their fingers, toes, and private parts had been cut off and stuck in their mouths. Their bodies, now bloated beyond all chance of recognition, were filled full of arrows, which made them resemble porcupines. Upon each exposed abdomen had been placed a mass of live coals. One wretched man, who, fighting hard till the last, had evidently been wounded, was found chained between 2 wagon wheels, and a fire having been made from the wagon pole had slowly roasted him to death, burnt to a crisp." But that's nothing compared to what I'm going to share next. Warning, this is not for the faint of heart. Rachel Plummer, one of Cynthia Ann's relatives who was taken in the same raid, was pregnant at the time of her abduction. And unlike young Cynthia, Rachel wasn't lucky enough to get adopted. She was given to an elderly Comanche as a slave, and treated as such. Subjugated to daily beatings and grueling manual labor, she miraculously was still able to carry to term and give birth to a healthy baby. But the Comanche who owned her didn't want the inconvenience of having a baby around. It was brought to council, and one day, the baby being only 7 weeks old, 6 Comanche men came to Rachel, held her down as one of them strangled the baby to death. He handed the dead child back to her just to show her it was dead, and then he took the lifeless body back again, this time tying a rope around his neck and dragging him through the prickly pear cactus, eventually dragging him behind a horse even. This poor baby was not only dead, but torn to shreds. All because if she had to breastfeed a baby, she wouldn't be as productive as a slave. So fucking barbaric. So evil. And it's pretty hard to excuse this type of behavior. It's hard to even think about, but I will try to put it into perspective through the lens of history. To us nowadays, no matter where you're from, what your ethnicity is, all that stuff, this shit's unthinkable. It's an unthinkable evil on an innocent, helpless life. And to the white people of the mid-19th century, it was also seen that way. But the Comanche were not civilized. They were literally a Stone Age people who all of a sudden were thrust into conflict with, at the time, was modern science, thought, medicine, and civilization. They were effectively 4,000 years behind on the civilization game. The Europeans who first came to America had access to centuries worth of technology. And if you want to get a good idea as to why some cultures were able to advance faster than others, you might want to give Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jerry Diamond a read. Spoiler alert, it doesn't have shit to do with your skin color or ethnicity. It has a lot to do with luck, though. You know, you're just the access to trade routes and fertile lands, natural resources, stuff like that. Really interesting book. Anyway, yes, the Comanche were vicious, but they weren't the only ones. The American settlers and military were guilty of exactly the same behavior. The slave trade was booming in 1840 at the time of the Parker raid, and slaves, no matter the culture, are slaves, not considered to be fully human, just a possession. This is how the Comanche treated their slaves, and it's also how the so-called enlightened civilized whites treated theirs as well. Legally able to beat and rape their African possessions, regularly breaking up families, refusing their children even a basic education. And these slaves, much like the Native Americans, once freed, they were subjected to decades and decades of government-sanctioned discrimination. And what's more, no matter what the color of your skin is, you, listener, have ancestors that committed these same types of atrocities. Are you German or French? Congratulations. Your people were once barbarian raiders. Are you Scandinavian? Well, we all know how the Vikings treated their victims. The Romans, the Greeks, the Persians, they all took part in historical atrocities. And even recently, look at how the Japanese treated that village of Nanking when they captured it. Or look into the Japanese Unit 731 if you really want to fucking have nightmares. And let's not forget the Germans just a little over 70 years ago. You can't make me believe that the regular citizens didn't know what the fuck was going on in those concentration camps just outside of their villages. And us Americans aren't as squeaky clean as we like to think we are. Just look back at the Sand Creek Massacre. In 1864, blowhard and total piece of shit, John Chivington led a force of 250 soldiers to attack a peaceful band of Cheyenne under Chief Black Kettle, killing at least 70 natives, mostly women and children. John S. Smith, a soldier, would go on to testify to Congress that he saw bodies of those lying there cut all to pieces. Worse mutilated than any I ever saw before. The women were all cut to pieces, with knives, scalped, their brains knocked out. Children 2 or 3 months old, all ages lying there, from suckling infants to warriors. By whom were they mutilated? By the United States troops. Another witness, Robert Bent, testified, quote, "I saw one squaw laying on the bank whose leg had been broken. A soldier came up to her with a drawn saber. She raised her arm to protect herself. He struck, breaking her arm. She rolled over, raised her other arm. He struck, breaking that, and then left her without killing her. I saw one squaw cut open with an unborn child laying by her side. The fuck, man? They cut a fucking baby out of her belly. Other testimonies go as follow. There was one little child, probably 3 years old, just big enough to walk through the sand. The Indians had gone ahead and this little child was behind, following after them. The little fellow was perfectly naked, traveling in the sand. I saw one man get off his horse at a distance of about 75 yards, draw up his rifle and fire. He missed the child. Another man came up and said, "Let me try the son of a bitch. I can hit him." He got down off his horse, kneeled down and fired at the little child, but he missed him. A third man came up and made a similar remark. He fired, and the little fellow dropped. Fingers and ears were cut off the bodies for the jewelry they carried. The body of white antelope laying solitary in the creek bed was a prime target. Besides scalping him, the soldiers cut off his nose, ears, and testicles. The last for a tobacco pouch. And finally, famed mountain man and scout Kit Carson had this to say. Quote, "Just to think of that old dog Shivington and his dirty hounds up there at Sand Creek. His men shot down squaws and blew the brains out of innocent little children. You call such soldiers Christians, do you? And Indian savages? What do you suppose our Heavenly Father who made them and us think of these things? I tell you what, I don't like a hostile redskin any more than you do. But when they are hostile, I fought them, hard as any man. But I never yet drew a bead on a squaw or papoose, and I despise the man who would." Word up, Kit Carson. And at this same time in East Texas, many friendly tribes were being massacred and forced off their land into Indian territory. They were living on rich, cotton-ready soil, thus rationalizing their destruction. Even years later, look at how a band of Sioux were treated during the massacre of Wounded Knee. Men, women, children were all buried in a mass grave once the murdering was done. I bring up all this brutality to say this. Savagery and brutality was not a characteristic unique to the so-called red man. This is a human condition, one that's been going on since we were walking the earth with Neanderthals. And in Texas, there was plenty of atrocities committed on both sides, which resulted in a blood vengeance, which resulted in more vengeance, just an unbreakable chain of violence, which once set in place was almost impossible to stop. Evil begets evil. And it was in this environment that the mother of Quanah, Cynthia Ann, found herself at 9 years of age. Behind her lay 5 of her relatives dead and mutilated, and the rest hiding in the forest trying to make it to help. Their survivors would not be able to return and bury their dead for over a month. And when it came to captives, the Comanche would kill the babies. Women were usually gang raped, some were killed or tortured, but some were spared, especially if they were really young like Cynthia Ann. Pre-adolescents were often adopted into the tribe, which is exactly what fate had in store for young Cynthia. She was adopted into a family and raised as if she was their own daughter. Much like the Stands with Fists character in Dance with Wolves, she spent her formative and adult years as Comanche in every sense of the word. She quickly learned their language and culture to the point of even forgetting how to speak English altogether. And when she came of age, she married Peter Nakona, one of the men that captured her. And by all accounts, they enjoyed a happy marriage, even to the point that he never took another wife after her, a common practice amongst the Comanche, just due to his extreme fondness of Cynthia Ann. By the way, she's not Cynthia anymore. She was now going by her Comanche name, Nadua. The happy couple would have 3 children, Quanah, another son named Pecos, and a daughter named Prairie Flower. One more historical event I'd like to talk about that surely shaped Quanah Parker's destiny and definitely shaped that of the Comanche Nation. It was known as the Council House Fight, and it took place a few years before his birth. Basically, in 1840, a few Comanche chiefs showed up in San Antonio, and surprisingly enough, they wanted to talk peace. They were offered treaties in the past when the great Sam Houston was president of Texas, but they rejected all such offers. Now, though, they were becoming increasingly concerned about the constant encroachment upon their land by the Texans, and they were willing to talk peace. Only Houston wasn't president anymore. That position was now held by Marabou Labar, and he was very much of the opinion that the only good Indian was a dead Indian. Still, they entertained the Comanche chiefs. They heard them out and said they would only consider a treaty if the Comanche would return all of the white captives that they still held. The Comanche returned not long after with only one captive, a 15-year-old girl who showed horrific signs of torture. She had burn marks on her entire body. Her nose had been burned off, and she had been raped repeatedly. She reported to the Texas authorities that there were many more white captives that the Comanche still held on to. The Texans, meeting with the chiefs, pressed them on why they didn't return all the captives, like they were told to. One of the chiefs, named Spirit Talker, explained that he wasn't in charge of the other bands. He couldn't tell them what to do, that they were their captives, not his. Which is true. It's always a common misconception that tribes had just one chief. This idea is false. Each tribe has several bands, and a chief with influence in one band has 0 when it came to the goings-on of another. Either way, the Texans weren't having it. They fucking wanted their relatives back. And can you blame them? The Comanche were told flat out that they now were hostages. Their families would be allowed to return home and spread the word. Return all captive whites immediately. Until then, the chiefs would remain in custody. And the chiefs, upon hearing this, immediately rose up, pulling out hidden knives and slashing and stabbing their way to freedom. And so did their women and children. As bravely as they fought, they were horribly outnumbered. Within an hour or so, the battle was over. The death tally was 30 warriors, 3 women, and 2 children. 32 Comanche were taken prisoner and thrown into jail, all save one, a female. She was sent back to her people to spread the news, and an ultimatum: release the captives. And if this Comanche woman didn't return within 12 days, the Comanche that the Texans held captive would be killed. The Comanche were fucking pissed once they found out what happened. And they promptly took 13 white captives and brutally tortured them to death, including the 6-year-old little sister of the 15-year-old girl I mentioned before. In turn, the Comanche hostages themselves were tortured by the Texans and given to the citizens of San Antonio as slaves. Remember what I said before about evil begets evil? The wheels of evil were definitely in motion now, with both sides holding a deep, deep hatred of the other. And now let's go ahead and take a quick break for a word from our sponsor. This episode of Bloody Beaver Podcast is brought to you by the highly priced and completely mediocre frozen meal home delivery service, Sad Sack. Are you lonely, lacking female companionship, and even just the basic mental fortitude to follow recipes online? Are you fucking sick and tired of eating the same old bullshit frozen meals in a bag day in and day out? Well, you're in luck. For roughly triple the price, Sad Sack will deliver basically the same meal to your door, just packaged slightly differently. Have you grown tired of the flavorless, conveniently packaged meal in a bag that you can pick up at literally any grocery store? Do you yearn for even less flavor? Or are you, like me, becoming increasingly more withdrawn from society and able to take the general public in lower and lower dosages as every day of your godforsaken life just drags on? Then Sad Sack has the deal for you. Never before has contracting dysentery become so easy. Sad Sack will deliver it straight to your damn door. Hell, if you tip the guy a little, maybe get a little seductive, if you know what I mean, he might even put it in your damn freezer. Enter in the promotional code Bloody Beaver for a chance to win a mini box of wine with each meal. This way you can further drown your sorrows on what will inevitably be another lonely, lonely night in a world that has left you far behind years ago. Sad Sack, as flavorless as my personality. All right, now let's talk about Quanah Parker. Let's get to the good stuff. Like I said before, Quanah was born about 1848. He was brought up in the traditional Comanche way, learning how to ride a horse shortly after he was able to walk. Learning the basics of fighting, warfare, hunting, tracking, all that good stuff. Inspired by oral histories passed on by his elders, stories of bravery, courage, sacrifice, and selflessness. He certainly grew up on tales of atrocities committed upon his people by the Mexicans and Texans, and his purpose was clear: to provide for and protect his family, his people, and his way of life. His enemies were also clear: the Texans to the southeast and the Mexicans to the southwest. Like many aspiring warriors, he probably went on his first raid around the age of 14. Not so much participating in battle, but just kind of standing as a lookout for the horses and stuff, and more importantly, learning how a man should behave and conduct himself on a military campaign. But before that time would come for him, tragedy struck Quanah's village. In December of 1860, 24 years after the raid on the Parkers, Cynthia Ann, now known as Nadua, was subjected again to another life-altering raid. This time it was conducted by a combined force of U.S. military and Texas Rangers. The Battle of Pease River, as it would come to be called, was one in a long line of battles of retribution. In this instance, it was in response to a recent Comanche raid on white settlers. And by this time, the Texas Rangers had become a little more savvy on how to take the fight to the natives. The Texas Rangers had been around since the time of the Parker raid, and it didn't take long for them to become expert Indian fighters. One of their main strategies involved taking the offense and bringing the fight to the Comanche themselves, in Comanche territory, something that the Spanish or the Mexican soldiers before them were never really able to accomplish. And that's basically what happened at the Pease River that December day. Sul Ross, future governor of Texas, led the charge of 60 men into the surprise village. They were able to capture Cynthia along with her infant daughter, Prairie Flower. Upon noticing that she wasn't a Comanche but a white woman, the Texans, quote, rescued Cynthia, ultimately bringing her back home to the remaining Parker family. Quanah would have been about 12 years old at this time. Chief Nakona, Quanah's father, was said to have been killed in the raid, according to the Texas Rangers, but this is something that Quanah would later go on to deny, saying his father wasn't even at the village at the time of the raid. Either way, Quanah and his younger brother were the only 2 members of the village able to escape. And as you can expect, young Quanah was heartbroken over the loss of his mother, which only solidified his hatred for these pale faces and their damn settlements. After his father died, either in that raid or a year or so later of disease, Quanah joined the Nakoni band of the Comanche. The chief named Horseback took Quanah under his wing to some extent. He and his younger brother were orphans, and life for an orphan isn't easy, no matter what culture you're living in. Quanah would later go on to say that, quote, "We were often treated very cruelly, as orphans only of Indians are treated." It wouldn't be long before his younger brother would die, leaving Quanah truly alone. He said, quote, "It then seemed to me that I was left friendless. I often had to beg for my food and clothes and could scarcely get anybody to make or mend clothes for me. I at least learned then that I was more cruelly treated than other orphans on account of my white blood." So yeah, not only are you an orphan, but there was surely some prejudice going on as well. I'm sure many people didn't consider him fully Comanche due to his mother being white. And this is something that I can kind of relate to, this whole mixed heritage persecution thing. I recently took one of those 23andMe tests, and it turns out that I'm mostly completely European. However, I am 0.1% Filipino, which kind of came as a shock. I'm a blue-eyed white boy from Texas. How the hell did some Filipino get slid in the mix? It's cool with me, though. I mean, I'm fine with it. My girlfriend, on the other hand, it's a whole different story. Ever since she found out about it, she's just constantly been low-key racially slurring me. Sometimes she just walks into the room and pulls up the corners of her eyes and just giggles. Okay, haha, funny, whatever. I overheard her on the phone the other day telling one of her friends that I'm her little Filipino mail-order bride. She called me a fligger the other day with a very hard R. And she's taken to calling me her little tailless monkey, which honestly, dude, I don't even know what the fuck that means. I don't know. I feel like I'm a victim of verbal abuse, really. Enough about my problems. Let's get back to Quanah. Like Johnny Cash once sang, in A Boy Named Sue, Quanah grew up quick and he grew up mean. His fists got hard and his wits got keen. And also probably hitting puberty helped. He'd grow to a height of 6 foot tall, making him taller than most other Comanche. And looking at pictures of Quanah, he isn't a small man. He's not a little tiny guy you want to fuck with. I'm sure he had to make his bones really, really quickly at that young age to let other Comanches know that he wasn't to be messed with. Kind of like starting at a new school. And like I said earlier, around the age of 14, he probably went on his first raid as a helper. But at the age of 15, Quanah would actually become a warrior. This raid in question consisted of about 30 warriors, and they were able to steal 38 horses on the outskirts of San Antonio. They were pursued, but per usual, quickly outdistanced their pursuers, returning home victorious, with their new horse herd and 2 fresh scalps. A dance was then held in their honor. This would have been about 1863. The Civil War was on in full force back east, and virtually every man of fighting age in Texas would have been serving. There was a very small force of fighters still left in Texas, and they were no match at all for the Comanche. This fact was not lost on the Plains tribes, especially not on the savvy Nermina. By 1864, they were riding roughshod on settlements all the way from Colorado to South Texas with little fear of retribution. And as the line of settlements was being pushed back hundreds of miles, Quanah first began earning a reputation as a fighter. On his second official raid, he and about 60 other warriors struck into New Mexico. They spotted a group of U.S. cavalry and decided to steal their mules, which they did, because they were good at that type of shit. They were then pursued and engaged in battle, and Quanah, along with a couple other young warriors, drove the mules into the mountains while the others held off the soldiers. As soon as the sun went down, they were able to sneak out and head home, once again victorious, and once again another dance was held in their honor. That's 2 textbook, perfectly executed raids that Quanah now had under his belt, and they both resulted in riches in the form of horseflesh. They were expertly able to elude the pursuers, and most importantly, no Comanche were killed. Unlike the white soldiers fighting in the war back east, no Comanche or any Native American tribe would be willing to sacrifice so many of their warriors live in a single battle. Even the loss of 1 or 2 warriors was catastrophic, and also considered bad medicine, which I will get to what the whole bad medicine thing means in a moment. But one thing that's been true since the first caveman went to war with the Neanderthals, perfect raids are the exception, not the rule. Also, the war between the states would end in 1865, and the men started trickling back into Texas. Battle-hardened men. Also with them came Yankee soldiers. A little something called Reconstruction was underway. The U.S. military arrived in Texas on June 19, 1865 to take possession of the state, restore order, and enforce the emancipation of slaves. This date is now commemorated as the holiday Juneteenth. On June 25th, troops raised the American flag in Austin, the state capital. And it's the United States Army who would now begin to try to rein in the mighty Comanche Nation. When Cynthia Ann was first captured in 1836, Texas had only been a sovereign country for about a month. And try as they might, as deadly effective as they were, the Texas Rangers were just too understaffed and underfunded to do much in regards to the Comanche and Kiowa, other than basically just responding to individual raids and trying to rescue captives. they were in no way able to launch a sustained military campaign into the heart of Comanche territory. But the U.S. military could, and now that they were involved, they'd slowly begin to turn up the heat on the Comanche. Quanah got a taste of disaster in 1868 at the age of 20 when he took part in an extended raid into Mexico with 9 other young warriors. This was sort of a coming-of-age tradition for the Comanche, and these deep raids sometimes lasted as long as 2 years. They'd take with them only the bare necessities of warfare and travel up to 1,000 miles or more to Mexico to raid and plunder. But like I said, the war was over. It was getting harder to travel undetected, and forts were beginning to pop up all over the damn place. Quanah's party was only out for a couple of months, twice having to go without water for 2 days. They nearly starved in Mexico and were only able to steal a few horses. And to make matters worse, Quanah and a friend lost their mounts on the way back to Texas, and they had to head to their village on foot. You know that shit had to be embarrassing as hell for a Comanche. This time, there were no victory dances to celebrate his return. In that same year, he participated in a few raids against Texas settlements. One of the raids was against the Legion Valley settlement, during which 7 captives were killed, including a baby and a 3-year-old. So here's where we go back to the whole, cruelty thing. Did Quanah Parker ever kill a baby? I don't know. But statistically speaking, probably. I mean, he was a full-fledged Comanche warrior. And that's what they did. Look, my parents have been happily married for 54 years. But when my dad was 21, he spent a year fighting in Vietnam. He was actually drafted on my parents' 1-year wedding anniversary. I would never ask him this, and I don't want to fucking know. But did he sleep with a Vietnamese prostitute during this time, thus cheating on my mom? I don't know. But probably. He was young, convinced he'd never survive the war, and the area they were in was full of beautifully exotic Vietnamese women, many of which were mixed with French blood. I've read many books that are first-hand accounts of soldiers and Marines serving in Vietnam, and I don't recall one book where the author didn't admit to sleeping with a prostitute. Does this excuse adultery? Nope. But it's a whole hell of a lot different than just some asshole that's bored with his marriage and decides to make a secret Tinder account. If my dad did this, I wouldn't condemn him. Just as I don't condemn Quanah for what he probably, statistically speaking, did. Like I said before, he was raised in a Stone Age culture. Warfare was literally their way of life. And there's also the theory that this type of brutality served as a tactical purpose. The idea being that one sure way to roll back the frontier and keep the whites out of their territory was torture, rape, and kill. Psychological warfare in a way. It's one thing for a man to risk his own neck in a hostile country, but would you try to settle on land and cultivate a farm when you know full well that if your family is caught, they will be raped and killed? Back to Quanah Parker. It was around the time of this raid that he would become a war chief. During a raid in the late 1860s, the Comanche struck hard and fast at the settlements near Fort Worth, stealing a shit ton of horses. But with Reconstruction now in full swing, they weren't able to get away without a fight. A large force of soldiers caught up with them at the Red River, and a bloody battle ensued. During this battle, the war party's chief was killed. And this is a big thing with Native Americans. It's very bad medicine, and many times it will result in the battle's momentum swinging in favor of their opponents. Usually when this happens, the natives will try to collect the bodies of their fallen and escape without their stolen horses. Not this fucking time. Quanah took over. Yelling at the warriors to spread out, giving them clear directions, he prioritized and executed in a way that would give Jocko Willink an erection. In other words, Quanah got some, y'all. He turned his horse and charged at one of the soldiers that was chasing after him. They went at each other head on, the soldier firing his revolver and Quanah his arrows. The soldier missed. Quanah did not. But now he was exposed to the rest of the soldiers, so he swung under his horse Comanche style, bullets whizzing past, and joined the band of fleeing raiders. They still had the stolen horses, and the soldiers had had enough. That night around the campfire, Quanah was chosen as the party's leader. During another raid, they did their typical thing, stealing horses and killing a few people, and once again, they were being pursued and engaged in combat. This time, however, the whites had long-range buffalo rifles with them, and the Comanche, while double the force of the whites in this case, soon found themselves losing the battle. Once again, Quanah pulled a Jocko Willink and implemented a cover and move tactic. While his band was escaping, Quanah stayed behind, hidden, until 2 pursuers rode up. Jumping out of concealment, he killed them both with his lance. This rallied his companions, who stopped fleeing, turned, and charged at their pursuers, who were now forced to take cover. What followed was a brief standoff, and then the Comanche were able to escape under the cover of darkness. That night, Quanah was once again elected as that party's leader. Now that his bravery on the battlefield was established, it was time for Quanah to marry and start a family. And he had his eyes set on a sweet young thing named Wakia. He loved her and she loved him. Unfortunately, as what often happens nowadays, Wakia's father didn't fucking like Quanah at all. Gotta love asshole dads, man. I was almost shot by one, but that's a different story for a different day. partly because Quanah was an orphan, thus poor, and partly because of his white blood, the modern-day equivalent of a white girl coming home from college with her black boyfriend. Well, Kia's father wasn't having none of this shit, so they fucking eloped. Quanah did it the smart way, though. He and his lover didn't just run off alone, but they took 21 young Comanche warriors with them. By eloping with Kia and not paying a dowry to her father, Quanah was at risk of being killed. But with this force of warriors, he wouldn't be such an easy target. Even still, they traveled at night, they split up several times, and they finally set up camp near present-day San Angelo, Texas. And as Quanah later put it, quote, "We went to stealing horses." And still they did. All over Texas. They stayed at this camp for over a year, amassing a huge herd, and for Quanah, he amassed power. He was the leader of this camp. A quick note about chiefs. They aren't really elected like we elect political people nowadays. If you're a Comanche and you can convince others to follow you on a raid, you're now a fucking chief. And it wasn't like some mandatory thing. If someone didn't want to follow you on a raid, they just simply didn't. But with Quanah's bravery, his fighting skills, his intelligence, his charisma, and his success at horse stealing, it's no surprise that warriors would flock to him, even at such a young age. It wasn't long before his band of 21 warriors grew to several hundred. But the Comanche warrior who was supposed to marry Wakia was still pissed off. He started his own band of warriors towards Quanah's camp and was probably pretty surprised when he saw how outnumbered he was. Alarmed for his own safety and not wanting to fight anymore, he decided to negotiate. After a little haggling, Quanah agreed to pay him 19 horses, and in return, he'd be able to go back to his old band, which he actually did the next day, returning home horse-rich and a fully fledged war chief. And this particular band of the Comanche that Quanah returned to was the Cohati, or the Antelope Eaters. They were the most isolated band of the Comanche living in the heart of Comanchero. Their domain included the Palo Duro Canyon of the Texas Panhandle. Now, enter into the picture a Ronald Slidell McKenzie. 31-year-old McKenzie was an up-and-comer in the U.S. Army, having served exceptionally during the Civil War. McKenzie, a West Point graduate, saw action at the Second Battle of Bull Run, Gettysburg, and Appomattox, amongst many other battles. This man was no stranger to war. In 1867, he was promoted to colonel and given command of the 41st Infantry Regiment, one of 6 segregated regiments created at the end of the Civil War. And he and the 41st were sent to Texas. They engaged in a few skirmishes with hostile Native Americans, but in 1871, McKenzie got yet another promotion. He was given command of the 4th Cavalry Division. McKenzie wrote a letter to General Sherman advocating a large-style campaign against the Comanche, something that no one had ever been able to successfully accomplish. He said, quote, "They needed to be brought under, and this could only be accomplished by the Army. It is very important that we deal with the Staked Plains people first," meaning the Comanche. The Llano Estacado, where they lived, translates into the Staked Plains. And McKenzie did just that. In the fall of 1871, he took a force of 600 mounted soldiers and, all armed with revolvers and repeating rifles, and 25 Tonkawa scouts, rode deep into the heart of Comanche territory. They were able to find a camp of Comanche, the Cohatis, under the leadership of Quanah Parker himself. On the night of October 10th, Quanah led a raid straight through the army camp. They stampeded horses, they crashed into sleeping soldiers, they were yelling and shooting, they even nearly ran over McKenzie's tent. Quanah's intention was to run off the entire herd of the 4th, thus surely sealing their fate. As it was, he was only able to get away with about 66 horses, but that meant that 66 soldiers were put afoot and out of commission. The next day, however, McKenzie pressed on, undaunted, and once again, the Comanche were able to get the upper hand. You know the trick, you just get a few young warriors to make themselves seen and then run away, thus enticing soldiers to pursue them, after what they consider to be easy prey. Only the fleeing warriors would lead them straight into an ambush. It's a tactic that's been used by guerrilla fighters for centuries. And who led the ambush? None other than Quanah Parker himself. He had his men flank and surround the 12 soldiers who had came in pursuit, and they were quickly cut off. Their situation was desperate. Finally, while trying to break free, the horse carrying one of the soldiers faltered. Quanah quickly closed ranks and shot the young private in the head. The only thing to say of the other soldiers was that the main force of the 4th was just cresting over the ridge, causing Quanah to get the hell out of Dodge and defend his village. Quanah's band was not only vastly outnumbered, but outgunned as well. The Army's firepower was extremely more capable than the old rifles and the arrows of the Comanche. With the advent of repeating arms, the Comanche could no longer shoot more arrows than the whites could shoot bullets. Also, the effective range of these weapons had increased. The whites could engage with Native Americans at further distances than the Native Americans could effectively fire back. Quanah now had to ensure a successful escape for his camp. A camp that consisted not only of warriors, but women, children, old people, probably several thousand horses, supplies, shelters, dogs, provisions, you get the picture. They had to pack up and get the fuck out while a force of almost 600 soldiers were marching towards them. And they somehow did that. causing the army to keep up the chase, straight into the Staked Plains. And the Comanche employed another classic military tactic. They split up into several groups and crisscrossed paths, making it almost impossible for the scouts to determine which trail to follow. And then the Comanche doubled back, riding in the opposite direction, which now put them behind Mackenzie's forces. Over and over and over again, the Tonkawa scouts were able to find the trail, only to have the Comanche crisscross and elude them again. Finally, though, the army was able to close in on them. They started seeing the fleeing band in the distance. The Comanche then appeared on Mackenzie's flanks, surely trying to goad him into another ambush. This time, he refused to be distracted. Then something happened that's referred to here in Texas as a blue northern. The skies opened up and a mixture of rain, sleet, and snow poured down on the men. And night was falling. Mackenzie could either hunker down and ride out the storm, or attack in the midst of it. He hunkered down. These were conditions his men weren't suited for, and I think Mackenzie knew that. He probably knew that many of his soldiers could literally freeze to death, and he erred on the side of caution. The Comanche, however, were no strangers to blue northers. They continued moving forward, they moved straight into the storm, and they did not stop. The next morning, Mackenzie kind of made like a half-assed attempt to pursue, but he just gave up. I don't blame him. His supplies had been pushed to the limits, and he just turned his troops back home. Try another day. During these years following the Civil War, the Comanche Nation as a whole didn't remain free. Many had actually already moved onto the reservations in Oklahoma. Nor were they still who they had been during their glory days as the lords of the Southern Plains. Their numbers were decimated in 1816 as well in 1849 by a cholera epidemic that wiped out nearly half of the Comanche Nation. By 1870, there were fewer than 3,000 Comanche on planet Earth, and only 1,000 remained free, having refused to go onto the reservation. Quanah Parker and his Quahatis were amongst these free 1,000, and even now their stronghold was being invaded by the army. Settlers were fast encroaching, and then the buffalo hunters began showing up. According to educated guesses and people that are way smarter than me, there were an estimated 40 million buffalo, or more correctly, American bison, roaming the plains in 1830. By 1870, when Quanah was emerging as a war chief, that number had been reduced down to less than 6 million. By 1900, there were only 300 buffalo known to exist in the United States. So as you can see, obviously, the decline in buffalo was very swift. Astonishingly swift for the Native American tribes whose entire existence was hinged on buffalo as a food source. Not to even mention the fact that buffalo hides were what they made their clothing and shelters with. Even their fires were fueled by dry buffalo shit, seeing as how there weren't enough trees on the plains to keep their fire stoked. And I actually want to try that, by the way. The place I'm going to go deer hunting this year is kind of an open area with cattle grazing on it. So I'm going to gather up some dry cow patties and see how well they burn. Because I'm a fucking weirdo. So yeah, the buffalo were being quickly hunted to the point of extinction, and this was largely due to a demand for their hides. Buffalo hides, much like beaver pelts in years before, were becoming more and more valuable. People back east used the hides for coats and lap robes, and the tanneries turned the hides into dry belts for industrial machines. Even their bones were ground down into fertilizer. And as the law of supply and demand dictates, there were rough men willing to head into hostile territory and hunt these buffalo. Men willing to put their lives at stake to make a quick buck. These hide men included such famous Western characters as Wild Bill Cody, Wild Bill Hickok, Wild Billie Eilish. No, just kidding, not that stupid joke again. Seriously though, Wild Bill Cody, Wild Bill Hickok, Wyatt Earp spent time as a buffalo hunter, as well as Pat Garrett. Remember him from the Brushy Bill podcast? Future lawman Bat Masterson was a hide man as well. Armed with powerful long-range 50 caliber rifles, a good buffalo hunter could kill 100 to 200 buffalo in an hour or two, or up to 2,000 a season. And in the 1870s, these men flocked into Comanche and Kiowa territory and began decimating the great southern herd of the American bison. Without buffalo, the Comanches simply cannot exist. Not the way they traditionally had, at least. And then you had a slight change in the culture of the Comanche. They were starting to adapt into the ways of other tribes that they associated with. The Comanche never traditionally wore the long eagle feather headdresses. That was more of a Sioux and Cheyenne thing. They never also participated in their own sun dances. All of this changed at some point in the 1860s and 70s. Even Quanah himself abandoned his traditional buffalo headdress for feathers. And then you had all this new technology they were quickly becoming adapted to. No longer were they 100% self-reliant. They were increasingly more and more dependent on the white man's goods. Their stone arrowheads were being replaced by metal. They used metal cups and brass kettles to cook out of. Their stone tools had been replaced by the metal knives and axes of the white man. Sugar, coffee, alcohol, and tobacco had been introduced into their way of life. And they were becoming more reliant on the white man's firearms. Life was much different for Quanah in 1871 when he was being pursued by Mackenzie than it was at the time of his birth a little over 2 decades prior. Quanah must have known that the end was coming for the Comanche, but they wouldn't go down without a fight. The Quahatis continued to raid. They continued to elude the military. They continued their refusal to sign a treaty and retire to the reservation. And they became more proactive when it came to the defense of their homeland and their buffalo from the encroaching hide hunters. Due to both the increased demand for buffalo hides and the long distance from Comanche to the trading center at Dodge City, the hunters established their own trading post at the abandoned Adobe Walls site in the panhandle of Texas. This allowed them to stay in the area to hunt longer, also allowing them to replenish basic supplies without traveling all the way back to civilization. Couple this with the fact that Quanah and the Comanche most assuredly were aware the Comanche just simply could not allow this trading post to remain operating. It was during this time of distress amongst the Comanche that a prophet emerged. His name was EXPLICIT. I'm probably horribly mispronouncing that, but I'll tell you what's easy to pronounce, the translation of his name. EXPLICIT's name translates into coyote vagina. I shit you not, I'm not making that up. Coyote vagina was what we refer to now as a medicine man or a holy man. He claimed to have healing powers and that he could raise the dead. Though he himself never engaged in battle, he claimed that the white man's bullets couldn't harm him. And not only that, but he could make medicine that would assure that others wouldn't be touched by the bullets either. So I mentioned bad medicine earlier. When medicine is mentioned in regards to Native American tribes, it isn't in the same sense that we think of modern medicine today. Coyote vagina wasn't trying to make some homemade Sudafed to stop the Comanches from being shot. No, it was more like magic, or in some instances, luck. Bad medicine during a battle, like say when a chief was killed, was more like a bad omen. It was considered a sign that they needed to abandon the fight and get the hell out before more bad shit happens. Many a white man was saved when the Native Americans had some bad medicine. In the case of Coyote Vagina, I'm never going to get tired of saying his name, it was more like magic. A spell almost that he could invoke that would just make the Comanche invincible. He was really good with magic tricks that are even used to this day, such as sleight of hand. And like all good con men, he was charismatic and believable. One trick he used, according to an Indian agent, was that he would have his followers stare into the sun, telling them not to stop until he spoke to them. Then he'd have them slowly lower their gaze to where he was standing, and as they did, they'd see dark bodies descending from heaven to receive him. You know, fucking sunspots. He would then slip away and remain in hiding until he, quote, returned from the heavens. Just a con artist. And if it seems like I'm being harsh on EXPLICIT, it's because not only was he a charlatan, but as you'll soon find out, his tricks cost the lives of actual living human beings. And then later in life, he was kind of a thorn in Quanah's side, opposing him when he could and trying to take his position as head chief. Regardless, word spread among the Native Americans about Coyote Vagina, and people flocked to him. Not only the Comanche, but bands of Southern Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Kiowa. He had a message to spread. He said that if they would just purify themselves and stop following the white man's ways, they could take back their land. No longer would the white man's bullets be able to harm them. And Quanah, just like everybody else, kind of fell for it. Quanah went from camp to camp recruiting warriors for a big raid. And being the tactician that he was, he would even call some warriors' manhood into question if they seemed hesitant to enlist. You know, like really subtle, yeah, man, I don't know. I'm going on this raid, but maybe you should stay home. You know, it's going to be dangerous. Maybe you're just not cut out for it, you know? Shit like that, I can only assume. And he was great at recruitment. Men wanted to fight at his side. Under Quanah's leadership and Coyote Vagina's big medicine, a force of 250, mostly Comanche and Cheyenne, descended upon Adobe Walls on the 27th of June, 1874. To put this into context and just a frame of reference, touching back on my last episode on the real-life Lonesome Dove, remember when Gus rescued Lorena from Blue Duck? They camped out that night in some ruins, and Gus tried to engage Lori in conversation, you know, just basically trying to pull her back out of shock. He found some old buttons, and they used them as pretend money so they could play cards. He mentions to her that there was a big fight at that place years earlier, and that he had heard there was a woman at the location. That's probably where the buttons came from. This was Adobe Walls. He was referring to the second battle of Adobe Walls. The first battle took place 10 years prior, during which Kit Carson and his troops narrowly escaped massacre. Returning to our current timeline, in 1874, the trading post held 27 men and 1 woman. Gus was right about the woman. Accounts differ as to how many Comanche warriors attacked the post. One claim says it could have been as many as 700. And oftentimes these claims are highly exaggerated, so I'm going to err on the side of caution and go with a lower claim of 250. Even still, 250 against 28 isn't exactly good odds. I don't want to delve too deep into this battle. It definitely deserves its own podcast episode one day, so I'll just give you a real quick summary. Obviously, the combined force of Comanche, Kiowa, Arapaho, and Cheyenne had worked themselves up into a frenzy. Between Coyote Vagina's magic and promises of success, and their desire to eradicate this stain off of their land, they were boiling for a fight. By the way, this trading post was illegal. This was land ceded to the Comanche as hunting ground as per the Medicine Lodge Treaty of 1864. These hunters had no legal right to be there. And they got lucky. It easily could have been a massacre. The Comanche were going to sweep down upon the sleeping hunters and crush them. And it should have worked. But a strange sequence of events caused the hunters to be awake when the attack happened. Instead of finding the hunters asleep, they were barricaded in various buildings. The Comanche were instantly met with gunfire. The element of surprise was lost. And not only that, these weren't just some run-of-the-mill settlers or fresh-faced soldiers that the Comanche were attacking. These were rough, hardened buffalo hunters, some of which were veterans of the Civil War. All of them were expert shots with the rifle, and the rifles, like I touched on before, could shoot farther than any weapons the hostiles possessed. Those big 50 caliber rifles could knock down a 2,000-pound buffalo from 1,000 yards away. Billy Dixon, a future Medal of Honor recipient, was one of the defenders, as was Bat Masterson, who would go on to become a legendary lawman and gunfighter. These men were not greenhorns, and as desperate as the Comanche were to get them the hell out of their territory, these defenders were equally as desperate to live. Quanah had his horse shot out from under him during the battle, forcing him to take shelter behind a buffalo carcass. Another heavy bullet slammed into the carcass, ricocheting and striking him between the neck and shoulder blade. So much for Coyote Vagina's magic. The raiders were forced back farther and farther just due to the relentless aim of the buffalo hunters, and Coyote Vag, well away from danger, watched it all go down from a distance. Nothing he had said came true, and the warriors were dropping left and right. One Cheyenne warrior was so enraged that he struck Coyote Vagina in the face with a riding quirt. Others demanded to know why his medicine failed. One even saying that if he was so immune to the white man's bullets, then he should go out and retrieve the dead warriors. But of course he didn't. Partly because he was full of shit, and partly because his horse was then shot out from underneath him. A warrior next to him was then shot dead. They weren't quite far away enough from those deadly 50 cals. The effect on the natives was pure shock. They had only lost 15 dead that day, or at least that's how many bodies they had to leave behind because they were too close to retrieve them. But it was the shock of Isatae's medicine failing them in such a horrendous way that really caused them to lose heart. By 5 o'clock that evening, the battle was over. Only 4 of the trading post defenders had been killed. And nothing changed. Adobe walls was soon thereafter reinforced with an additional 70 hunters, and they were able to continue slaughtering the buffalo. Were the Comanche fools to follow such an obvious charlatan as Isatae? I don't know. Are millions of Americans fools to follow the doomsday preachers like Hagee or obvious fraudulent faith healers like Benny Hinn or Kenneth Copeland? Giving false hope and bilking elderly people out of their savings for vials of holy water? I went to a small Baptist church as a child. Salt of the earth people. One couple had a child suffering from illness that I can't recall what it was, but you could tell by looking at her that she wasn't long for this world. This couple took their child to a Benny Hinn conference out of desperation. Maybe, just maybe, he could heal her. He didn't, and she died. This is no reflection on them or their faith. They were desperate parents grasping at any possible straws to save the life of a daughter that they loved. I assumed that in the mid-1870s, knowing their way of life was over, these Comanche were doing the same. They wanted to believe they could get their former way of life back. They needed to believe. Desperate people are prone to desperate actions. And at this point in time, the Comanche Nation was definitely in a desperate situation. Although furious at defeat and frustrated as fuck by Coyote Vagina, the Comanche continued to raid. From Colorado to Texas, in all directions, these warring bands would take their frustration out on any whites they could find. Buffalo hunters, settlers, whoever. Following Adobe walls, Quanah himself stated, quote, "I take all men, go on warpath to Texas. Stagecoaches were attacked. Hunters were tortured and killed. Women were raped and murdered. Those raids that summer killed an estimated 179 settlers. And it was effective. Hide hunting then stopped. Settlers fled for the safety of civilization. The big raid failed, but the anger raids that followed succeeded to their means. They once again pushed the white man out of their land. This push had the unintended consequences of exhausting the patience of the U.S. government, however. Shit was now real. All Comanche were ordered onto the reservation. All restrictions were removed from the army. They were ordered to attack in force and even able to pursue hostiles hiding on the reservation. Their mission was to subdue all Indians who offered resistance to authority. Basically, hunt them down, capture them, and kill those that resist. This resulted in what would become known as the Red River War. Earlier, I mentioned that there were only about 1,000 free Comanche left. Well, that's also including women and children. There were probably only about 300 warriors at this time. 300 fighting men against the entire western force of the United States military. Couple them in with some renegade Cheyenne and Kiowa, there were probably only 800 fighting men on all of the southern plains. And their area of operation or headquarters was the Texas Panhandle. This is where the army would eventually find them. The tactics that the army would enforce would be relentless. They would not give the Comanche time to rest. They wouldn't give them time to hunt. They'd burn any villages they could find, including abandoned supplies that the Comanche rely on to make it through the leaner winter months. The Nurmina, the people, they never had a chance. Not to too quickly summarize the Red River War, but there were a few skirmishes. The military was able, finally, to take the fight straight to the Comanche, no matter where they were, and the Native American villages they found were at a very distinct disadvantage. The soldiers, as cold and miserable as they may be, and as brave as they were, only had their duty to fulfill, to fight the Comanche. The Comanche warriors, on the other hand, they not only had to fight, but somehow ensured that their families, their children and wives and old, could escape to safety. The way a warrior would fight on a raid would be completely different than the way they would fight to protect their village. You'll risk more to protect your family. Take the Cheyenne Dog Soldiers, for example. They were an elite warrior society within the Cheyenne Nation. A select few were recruited each year, taking suicide vows and promising to defend their villages to their last breath. They wore a sash of tan hide about 8 to 10 inches long and carried a wooden stake. They'd shove this stake in the ground, wrap the sash around it, and that's where they'd die, fighting desperately till the very end, thus slowing down the attack and allowing their people to escape. While the Comanche didn't have any such warrior societies, surely there were always a few who'd look death in the eye. They knew what awaited their families if they were captured. The atrocities I've thus far mentioned being committed by the Comanche just wasn't something they did. All the other warrior tribes did the same thing. Many of the white soldiers wouldn't hesitate twice when it came down to killing women or children. And I'm sorry if that puts our brave fighting men in a bad light, but that's just history. It did happen time and time again in the 19th century. War is hell. And as such, Mackenzie marched his men down into the Palo Duro Canyon, long a sanctuary of the Comanche, in September of 1876, including scouts that numbered 642 in total. It became a running fight. The combined Comanche, Kiowa, and Cheyenne were able to escape with their families, but that's about it. Mackenzie burned their lodges, their supplies, everything they left behind. His was a war of annihilation, much like Sherman's March to the Sea. He was finally able to break the fighting spirit of this renegade warrior tribe, and that's just what he did. Because they also left behind their horses. Mackenzie ordered his men to round up all 1,424 captured horses, corral them into the canyons, and shoot them dead. The horse slaughter lasted for hours, finally ceasing at 3 o'clock that evening. Only 4 natives had been killed, but by killing their horses, they had just effectively broken the backbone of the great Comanche Nation. Their horses, the great power that allowed them to escape the rocky crags of the mountain and emerge as the dominant power on the southern plains, no longer existed. They were on foot, without shelter or supplies, and on the run. There was an estimated 1,000 lodges in that canyon that day, and most of these Comanche marched to Fort Sill, Oklahoma during the next couple of weeks, finally laying down their arms and becoming reservation Indians. That same year, 825 Southern Cheyenne gave up. Lone Wolf and the last of the Kiowa came into the reservation following that, and a number of small band of Comanches under leadership of Shaking Hand, only numbering 35 warriors and 140 women and children, also surrendered. All that remained was Quanah Parker and his band of Quahati. There were only 400 of them, including just 100 able-bodied fighting men. They were the last of the holdouts. If he didn't know it before, and I believe he probably knew it well before the Second Battle of Adobe Walls, his people's traditional way of life was definitely over. They had been defeated. So what now? Submit to the white man's ways, become a farmer? Or was there a different way? A way that meant keeping some of their power and individuality without becoming soulless tillers of the ground. Quanah and his band were great at hiding. He later said, quote, "We kept a good watch for the approach of the enemy. And when we would learn they were coming in our direction, we would quickly move. Several of my men with our families kept that tactic up all winter. During that time, we were almost continuously going, as the soldiers were after us many times and they were almost upon us." Finally, desperate and unable to locate Quanah, Mackenzie enlisted the help of a reservation doctor who was also a translator, with his Cadeau wife, plus 3 Comanche to seek out Quanah and try to get him to come in. And miracle upon miracle, probably because of the 3 Comanche in the party, they were able to locate Quanah, something that the military absolutely could not do. And believe it or not, Quanah was receptive. They spent 2 days in a council with Quanah. Well, him and that damn coyote vagina, I don't know what the hell he's still doing in the picture, but he was. He had that coyote pussy control, I guess. Anyway, Quanah was ready to listen. Like I mentioned before, he knew the Nurmina way of life was over. It was time to take the next path. He was done fighting, at least in the physical sense. There would be no more raiding, no more of the glory he once knew as a young warrior, just able to travel as he pleased. There would be no more great buffalo hunts. It was over. But the Comanche, as live human beings, weren't over. And Quanah wasn't over. He was only 28 years old. He would actually continue to fight, and like he had always done, the fight would be for his people, only in a different way. So, finally, on May 6, 1875, Quanah's band left for Fort Sill. But they weren't in a hurry. They weren't in that great a shape after a harsh winter and their horses were tired. They hunted as they traveled and held one final medicine dance. Almost a month later, they finally arrived at the reservation. Unlike other warring bands, they weren't treated harshly. For some reason, they were allowed to keep their horses. None of the men were confined to the jailhouse. Mackenzie himself had a strange fascination with Quanah. They lived in pretty close proximity to each other for a while, and it was Mackenzie who started teaching Quanah English, and basically the, quote, way of the white man. Mackenzie even went so far as inquiring about his mother's whereabouts and then delivering the sad news to Quanah that she and Prairie Flower had passed away, which I forgot to mention until now. Cynthia Ann did not want to return to her white family. She was forced to. And even though she had Prairie Flower to care for, she was desperately in fear for her 2 sons left behind, and she missed her husband. It was 1860 when she was brought back to civilization. She was passed from one family member to the next, often gawked at by outsiders. Her daughter died of the flu in 1864, and Cynthia Ann would only last another few years. After several failed tries to escape back to the Comanche, she eventually lost all hope, even to the point of refusing to eat. She died in 1871 at the age of 44, with a broken heart. And now Quanah, her son, would embark on his second path in life, a path that was completely different from the first part of his life. But his unique skill set as a warrior and a leader would serve him well. The quickness one needs when making snap decisions on a battlefield also works effectively at the negotiating table. Most of these tribes that were sent to the reservations were allotted monthly rations and basic supplies. As you can imagine, the rations were trash. They'd give them crappy clothes that would fit, cheap tools like axes and knives that would break. Their food was given to them on the hoof, which meant the cattle were still alive, and those cattle would lose weight in the winter, and they just didn't have enough meat on them to even make it worth slaughtering them. They were only valuable for their hides. This was no way for the Comanche to live, and Quanah knew it. He himself had wives and children to feed. That's right, plural wives. That old HBO show Big Love didn't have shit on Quanah Parker. Anyway, hunting was obviously out of the question, because the reservation land was just basically hunted out, and the buffalo were gone. Around this same time, a group of Comanches broke free from the reservation to search for buffalo. Quanah volunteered to pursue them and bring them back, which he did. Remember, he was an influential guy. When he spoke, people listened. In the same way he recruited for war parties as a younger man, he was now able to influence his brethren in other ways. In another such incident, a Comanche had murdered a soldier, and Quanah was able to track him down and bring him in. There was also another time when he was sent after some more renegade Comanche. He successfully persuaded them to come into the reservation, and then, continuing to work for his people, he convinced Mackenzie to not send the renegades off to Fort Leavenworth prison. He was definitely garnering for prestige amongst Mackenzie and the reservation agents, and it was working. By 1878, Quanah had already been named the head of the third largest beef band on the reservation. This would put him in charge of the distribution of goods. By 1880, he was the acknowledged leader of the Quahati, and the leader most often consulted by the reservation agent on Native American matters. He successfully lobbied the agent to let him and a mixed group of Kiowa and Comanche leave the reservation on a buffalo hunt. And this is a sad story, actually. They didn't find any buffalo, just bones. They pushed all the way into the heart of Palo Duro Canyon, their former stronghold, and they were shocked to find out it was already owned by a white man, just a few years after they had left it. And not just any white man, but Charlie Goodnight. You might remember him from the Lonesome Dove episode. He was also one of the men present in 1860 when Cynthia Ann Parker was recaptured. So, since they didn't find any buffalo, Quanah and his band started slaughtering Goodnight's cattle. Goodnight rode out to meet him, and things got a little tense. This was still, in their minds, their land. If they had known who Goodnight was at that moment, there may have even been violence. But Goodnight, total fib, and he said he was from Colorado, just due to there still being a lot of hatred for Texans in the Comanches' hearts. And he also struck a deal with them. While you're here, if you behave, you can take 2 beeves every other day to eat until you find the buffalo. Quanah agreed, and he and Goodnight's relationship would only solidify over time. Sadly, they never did find any buffalo, and they soon returned to the reservation empty-handed, and probably empty-hearted as well, I would imagine. But as luck would have it, there was a cattle trail that went straight through the heart of the reservation, and Quanah was able to make this work in his favor. Not only were these cattle herds not supposed to be on the reservation land, but they would purposely slow down and let their herds graze on the rich reservation grass before pushing north. Until, at least, the Comanche decided they wanted a taste as well. There's no such thing as a free lunch, motherfuckers. Quanah was the first one to set up basically a protection racket. And if you've never seen The Sopranos, maybe you should do yourself a favor, watch them, you'll know exactly what a protection racket is. Quanah would take a large band of warriors and surround a herd, basically saying that they needed to pay a toll to cross his land. And they did, and so would most of the cowboys. But those who didn't had their stock ran off in the middle of the night, in the same way that Quanah would stampede the army's horses in his old life. Those herds that did comply, however, were guided through the reservation, shown the best water sources. And what's more, they traveled under the protection of Quanah Parker himself. Basically, they remained unmolested by other groups on the reservation. Quanah then started lobbying for something pretty controversial. He wanted his people to be able to lease out their reservation land to the nearby ranches. They had 2 million acres available, and there were at least 35 cattle outfits lining up and begging for the opportunity to graze their cattle there. To Quanah, this meant an opportunity for his people to make some money. But to the other Comanche and the Kiowa, it was considered just giving the last of their land away to the white man. Many of the leaders, Coyote Vagina amongst them, said that Quanah was bought by the cattlemen. And to be fair, he kind of was. He was literally on the payroll of one of the big ranches. They contributed to Quanah's personal herd of cattle, as well as financed his trips to Washington, D.C. to lobby on their behalf. Quanah was playing the game, but he wasn't the only fucking one. His rivals, as far as the land deal went, had their own rackets going as well. Coyote Vag himself had a protection racket going on, allowing a rancher to graze 2,000 head of cattle on the reservation. There were other Comanche on the rancher's payroll. The Indian agent himself and other personnel were receiving payouts. Everybody was on the take. Quanah's idea was, hey, this shit's going to go on anyways. Let's just make it official, lease it out, and that way everybody gets paid. I think, at least. It is sort of complicated, and to be honest with you, I don't fully understand the inner politics at play here, but I do believe he was acting, it seems like to me, in the best interest of his people. And despite stiff opposition, Quanah had his way. In 1884, when the reservation members voted on the issue, they voted to approve leasing the land. And as part of the deal, the ranchers would have to hire a certain number of Comanche as cowboys, another example of Quanah looking out and ensuring at least a little bit of income coming in for his people. Quanah kept on climbing that political ladder. He was appointed to serve as a judge in the Court of Indian Affairs. He was instrumental in preventing the ghost dance cult from spreading throughout the reservation. And this is the same cult, by the way, that partially led to the horrific events at Wounded Knee Creek in 1890. He was personally prospering. His own cattle herd was growing. Charles Goodnight gave Quanah a prize breeding bull, and he began selective breeding. He had a farm that was tended by a white man, 200 hogs, 3 wagons, and 1 buggy. In 1890, he had a huge house built for himself and his family. It was a 2-story, 10-bedroom ranch house which provided a room for each of his wives as well as a huge dining area where Quanah could receive guests. Quanah started wearing nice wool suits and Stetson cowboy hats. He, as we already touched on, learned English, but in other ways he remained fully Comanche. He refused to cut his long hair, and he refused to stop practicing polygamy. He would have a total of 8 wives and 25 children, 2 of whom were adopted. 2 of Quanah's daughters married white men. He himself raised 2 white boys of his own. Once Quanah's fame spread, strangers would arrive at his house all the time hoping to meet the man. Family members were constantly camped out in the yard in their teepees. People knew that if they were hungry and in need, they could come to Quanah and be fed. He was becoming wealthy, but he didn't eat alone. He spread his wealth around. One thing I thought was funny was that during this time, Quanah hired a white lady to teach his wives how to cook. And I gotta disagree with Quanah on this one. If you're gonna hire somebody to teach your wife how to cook, first of all, you already fucked up. You should have married a lady that already knew how to cook, but whatever. If you're gonna hire someone to teach your wife how to cook, there's only 2 choices, both equally as good. Choice 1 being someone's abuela, an elderly Mexican grandmother. You know, someone that's been cooking up tamales since she was 8 fucking years old. Or choice number 2, a large, older black lady. The type of lady that calls everybody sugar and baby, and the more fat hanging off the bottom of her arm, the better she'll cook. That's just science. You're welcome. Anyway, he also hired a Russian lady to work as a servant. And just to give you an idea of the type of people who sat at his dinner table over the years, they include General Nelson Miles, Geronimo, Charlie Goodnight, British Ambassador Lord Bryce, commissioners, ranchers, and motherfucking President of the United States of America, Teddy Roosevelt. Quanah Parker had one of the first residential telephones in Oklahoma installed in his house. He also bought a car, an old ambulance, and he had his own driver, a deaf and mute Comanche named George Washington, whom everybody else called Dummy. And that's not nice. He also frequently rode in a locomotive on a nearby railroad, which was named after him. Evidently, he loved blowing the whistle and ringing the bell. He traveled a lot, loved staying in hotels, and loved all the modern-day features that society had to offer. And what a transformation. At the age of 25, Quanah would have, and could have, happily killed all those people that I mentioned him dining with earlier. And here he was, speaking their language, entertaining them at his own dinner table, in his huge house, cutting deals and gaining influence both amongst his newfound white friends and his Comanche people. In 1889, the U.S. Congress came up with yet another way to fuck over the Native Americans with the Dawes Act, an act that basically gave them the right to require that the Comanche give up tribal lands whenever the president wanted them to, and this gave teeth to something known as the Jerome Commission. The Jerome Commission was a 3-man panel whose goal was to get the natives to give up their collective tribal lands in exchange for private, individual parcels of land that would be subject to the normal laws of private property. And Quanah fucking had questions. He wanted to know how much they paid them for the land, and that was a question the commissioners had no answer for. Quanah wanted details. He wanted a thorough understanding of the deal before he'd make any decisions, and it frustrated the shit out of them. They tried to lowball Quanah by saying that much of the land was rocky and therefore not good for growing crops, to which he counter-argued that there was coal in such areas, as well as iron, silver, and even some gold mining potential. Quanah was towing the line here. He knew the Dawes Act would let the government take their land whenever they wanted, for free. But with the Jerome Commission, maybe his people could get paid. He was negotiating, and the negotiations actually paid off. Each tribe member was given 160 acres of land apiece and would sell what was left over to the government for $2 million. This whole land issue is kind of hard for me to understand. Was Quanah selling out his people just to make a buck? I don't think so. He actually lost money in the deal. He was previously in control of 40,000 acres that he rented out, and now he would only have 160. He also spent the next several years lobbying for changes in the terms, and he was kind of successful. 400,000 acres known as Big Pasture was given back to the Comanche, in which they continued to lease out to the ranchers and profit. The Comanche were now individual landowners. Nobody could touch the property, and they could do with it what they wanted, buy or sell. Quanah's influence and fame continued to rise. In 1905, he rode in Teddy Roosevelt's inaugural parade, decked out in buckskins and a war bonnet. Then Roosevelt traveled to Oklahoma and participated in a wolf hunt on Big Pasture, headed by none other than Quanah himself. Actually, Quanah received Roosevelt with a mounted honor guard, an armed honor guard. I guess since President McKinley had just been assassinated a few years earlier, Quanah wasn't going to let that shit happen on his watch, not to his guest. Can you imagine the Secret Service allowing that to happen nowadays? Quanah, ever the lobbyist, used the occasion to talk to Roosevelt about Native American issues, prompting the president to reach out to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. The president would then also go on to establish the Wichita Mountains Wildlife Refuge just north of Quanah's home. In 1908, at the age of 60, he appeared in the first two-reel movie ever made, called The Bank Robbery. You can see clips of it on YouTube. Actually, I think the whole thing might be on YouTube. It's kind of surreal actually seeing Quanah in action. And it was also in June of that year that Quanah became head of the school board in a brand new school district he helped create. Even donated the land for the school. Now the Comanche children could get a proper education. He also then started using peyote. Quanah liked to party. Peyote had been traditionally used by Native American cultures for years, and Quanah helped revive it amongst his people. The particular strain of peyote that Quanah helped cultivate came from a sacred traditional patch of Comanche land they called Ibiza, which loosely translates into English as a sad song. A lot of people don't know that that's what the song I Took a Pill in Ibiza is actually about. Fucking Quanah Parker, influencing modern day pop culture even now. That's not true at all. He did start using peyote though, but it wasn't because he liked to party, and it had nothing to do with the song I Took a Pill at Ibiza. The Comanche used peyote for religious purposes. Peyote, for you squares out there, is derived from a small, spineless cactus that produces hallucinogenic effects, kind of similar to LSD, mushrooms, or DMT, all that good stuff. Quanah and the Comanche found it useful for religious rituals that kind of helped them get through these early dark reservation years. Quanah himself would preside over these all-night rituals, and the news spread. Before long, the Kiowa, Pawnee, and the Shawnee were all using peyote, and it was instrumental in the formation of the Native American Church. One author wrote, quote, "It was probably the most important cultural contribution of the Comanches to the lives of other American Indians." And Quanah was judged pretty harshly by participating in these rituals, to which he replied, quote, "The white man goes into his church and talks about Jesus, but the Indian goes into his teepee and talks to Jesus." Wow, that resonates with me, man. I've actually really wanted to try something like peyote or DMT. I've heard so much about how people's lives are changed in a very positive way, how it just opens up just new ways of thinking. So many stories of people gaining a new, fresh perspective on life. And studies are starting to show that these hallucinogenics are very helpful in the treatment of drug addiction, even helping people stop smoking cigarettes. There's strong evidence that psilocybin and MDMA are highly effective when treating PTSD. And even just recently, 2 U.S. cities have decriminalized the use of, quote, magic mushrooms. I'm not going to lie. I too want to go into a teepee and talk to Jesus. But I'm kind of a pussy, and I'm afraid I'll end up having a conversation with the devil. And that's a conversation I really don't want to have. So, going forward, the Native American Church is still around to this day with over 250,000 members, and they are still participating in peyote rituals. As Quanah got older, he also got poorer. Most of his wives ended up leaving him as well. He had to keep fighting to keep his position as a principal chief of the Comanche. Coyote Pussy, that old scoundrel, was constantly trying to take the position for Quanah. He got in a fist fight with a Kiowa chief named Lone Wolf over a boundary dispute that ended up with a federal investigation being launched against Quanah. He was eventually exonerated, but it was a stressful time for the man. No longer rich, his wives were leaving, his own peers were trying to undermine him, but he continued to give and he continued to lead. And he continued to think about his mother, the white woman who lovingly raised him. And this to me is the most moving chapter of Quanah's life. As vicious as he was, as much of a warrior as he was, as tactical as he was still his mother's son. You hear stories about how dying soldiers use their last breath to call out for their mothers. Grown men bleeding out, not crying out for their wives, not crying out for their sweethearts back home, not crying out to God, but they're crying out for mom. From World War I to Vietnam, even as recently as a surgeon talking about it in the Crimean War, the bond between mother and son is something that transcends time and culture. It's very real and it's very powerful, even for a battle-hardened Comanche warrior such as Quanah. He hadn't seen his mother since he was 12 years old, but he was finally able to locate and visit her grave in 1909 at the age of 61. He had her body reburied at the Post-Oak Mission in Cache, Oklahoma, and gave a simple speech during the reinterment ceremony. He said, quote, 40 years ago, my mother died. She captured by Comanches, 9 years old. Love Indian and wildlife so well, no want to go back to white folks. All the same people anyway. God say, I love my mother. Quanah himself had less than 3 months left to live. Ever busy, he was constantly traveling, and just not feeling well, he ended up attending a peyote meeting with some Cheyenne just seeking a cure, but he still didn't feel any better. By the time he arrived home, he was in pretty bad shape, head bowed and lips trembling. He was taken to his house where he died on February 23rd of rheumatism-induced heart failure. He was buried next to his mother, whom he loved so dearly. And I like what author S.C. Gwynn had to say at the end of his book, Empire of the Summer Moon. So I'll just read it. I think it's a fitting end to the story. Speaking of Quanah's death, he writes, quote, the lords of the South Plains, meanwhile, were fast fading into America. That was what Aboriginal cultures did if they did not wish to vanish altogether. It would be inaccurate to say that the Comanche adapted well, or that Quanah was a model that the tribe as a whole was prepared or equipped to follow. The first generations of Comanche in captivity never really understood the concept of wealth or private property. The central truth of their lives was the past, the dimming memory of the wild, ecstatic freedom of the plains. Of the days when Comanche warriors and black buffalo headdresses rode unchallenged from Kansas to northern Mexico. Of a world without property or boundaries. What Quanah had that the rest of the tribe in later years did not was that most American of human traits. Boundless optimism. Quanah never looked back, an astonishing feat for someone who lived in such untrampled freedom on the open plains, and who had endured such a shattering transformation. In hard times, he looked resolutely forward towards something better. That sentiment appears, obliquely, on his gravestone, which reads, resting here until day breaks, and shadow falls, and darkness disappears. It's Quanah Parker, the last chief of the Comanche. His school-educated daughter probably wrote it, based loosely on a verse in Song of Solomon, a book of the Old Testament that settlers, among them Quanah's forefathers, carried with them into the lethal West, where Stone Age pagans on horseback once ruled the land, and Quanah would have been pleased. All right, well said, Mr. Gwynn. Quanah Parker didn't have an easy life, and the transition from warrior to statesman seems almost impossible to me. But he did it, and he tried his best to usher his people into a new way of life that he himself embraced. Sometimes not perfectly, not always succeeding, but his later life was spent, in my opinion, from what I've read, in the service of his people and his family. The primary duties of all warriors is such: protect your family and your village. I hope I've done justice for Quanah Parker on this episode, and the Comanche Nation as well. While doing research, I leaned heavily on the aforementioned book, Empire of the Summer Moon by S.C. Gwynn. I was fortunate enough to speak with two members of the Comanche Nation, one of which was a gentleman by the name of Ron Parker, a direct descendant of Quanah himself. I could be wrong, but I believe Quanah was Ron's great-great-grandfather, or great-grandfather. The other gentleman, Mr. Sopity, is the cultural specialist at the Comanche National Museum and Cultural Center in Lawton, Oklahoma, a place I can't wait to visit. Mr. Sopity was a pleasure to talk to, and you could tell he really loved his job as well as having a passion for Comanche history. I'd also like to point out the old phrase that states history is written by the victors. And when it comes to the colonization of the United States, the victors were clearly the white men. How much of our written history about Native Americans is correct? How much of what I talked about during this episode is correct? I believe much of it is, but I'm sure that there's stories passed down verbally amongst American Indians over the years that might contradict what our accepted history states. My grandmother was in her 90s when she died. She would often tell me stories about her grandfather who lived with her family when she was a young girl. This grandfather fought in the Civil War, and I've always thought it was so cool that I know somebody I've spoken with, somebody I've shared meals with, somebody that I had a loving relationship with, who did the same with somebody that fought in the Civil War. We're not as far away from history as we think we are. You know, it's so easy to imagine that the Civil War, for instance, being like 1,000 years ago. It wasn't. And neither were the days of Quanah Parker. I didn't ask Ron Parker, but it's almost assured that he had a relative who he personally knew at some point in his life who also knew Quanah before his death. I mean, Quanah died in 1911. That's only like one person away from us if you think about it. And as of right now, in August of 2019, the oldest living person in the United States was born in 1905, 6 years before Quanah's death. According to Wikipedia, there's a shitload of people still living in this country that were born while Quanah Parker was still alive. I stopped counting at like 70. The last veteran of the American Indian Wars died in February 5th, 1971. So if you're over the age of 48, congratulations. You were on this earth breathing the same air as someone who physically engaged in combat with Native Americans. And as late as 2014, there was still a Civil War pension being paid out to a surviving daughter of a Civil War veteran. This shit fascinates the hell out of me. In this age of instant gratification, it's so easy to forget. We live soft, climate-controlled lives. Our food is killed or grown by someone else. We suffer from an overabundance of resources and information that wouldn't have even been imaginable in the days of Quanah Parker, or even in the days of our great-grandparents. We got these supercomputers known as smartphones on our person all day, every day. You're probably listening to this podcast on your smartphone right now. That little rectangular magic machine contains the sum total of all human knowledge. You can teach yourself a foreign language, computer languages, calculus, how to fix your car. We have access to all of the greatest poets and philosophers known to history. And what do we do with such power? Well, we watch lesbian porn mostly, unless you're in Louisiana, and it's probably some stepsister porn. Okay? So, yeah. Anyway, I'm rambling like a motherfucker. All I'm trying to say is that it's easy to forget in such a crazy advanced times that we're not that far removed from being savages ourselves. We all, Native American or white or black or Asian or Egyptian or whatever the fuck, come from a long line of primitive people. Okay, I hope any Comanche people, Nirmana listening, or any Native Americans, I hope y'all didn't find anything I've said here too disrespectful. I hope I did Quanah Parker and the Comanche justice. Yours is a culture I've been fascinated with since childhood, a proud, dignified warrior people who fought back against impossible odds. There was no way they could have stopped the tide of civilization. And unfortunately, this country was not kind to the Native Americans. I spoke a little on a previous podcast episode about the horrific conditions of many reservations in these present days, something most Americans know nothing about, nor are most aware of the epidemic of missing Native American women, or the addiction problems that are associated with the poverty levels that they currently live in. A recent article I read from Associated Press talked about how many members of the Navajo Nation didn't have electricity running to their homes. And look at the Dakota Access Pipeline. The Standing Rock Sioux tribe has opposed this pipeline since day one. The pipeline would travel beneath the Missouri River, which is their primary drinking water source. And they don't fucking want their drinking water tainted by potential leaks. I've spent years working in the oil industry. Accidents happen all the time. I don't blame them one bit for being opposed to this. Despite their protests, the pipeline was completed as planned, but not until over 300 protesters were injured and over 400 arrested. And if you remember, a lot of the acts of violence were covered by the media. Attack dogs were used, people were shot by rubber bullets, armed soldiers and police in riot gear, and they deployed water cannons in freezing weather. And all of this was so very, very close to Wounded Knee Creek, where just 129 years ago, some 200 women and children were massacred by the 7th Cavalry. I'm no bleeding heart liberal, or a liberal at all. I actually skewed towards libertarian/conservative politics, mostly. But it seems to me that surely something can be done to help the most marginalized amongst our population. And don't call me Shirley. No, they're called Native Americans for a reason. They were here at least 12,000 years before we were. Why then are many living in such horrible conditions? And like I also said in a previous episode, I don't want to hear any of the, pull yourself up from the bootstraps argument. That's fucking hard to do when those bootstraps have been cut to shreds by hundreds of years of broken government treaties and government policies aimed at keeping you down. The Comanche, for example, went from being the uncontested lords of the Southern Plains to being just stuck on a reservation and expected to farm in the span of just a few decades. You know how much of a culture shock that had to be? What a steep learning curve you'd have to adapt to such a foreign concept. And since I'm already off on the longest tangent in the history of fucking podcasts, Let me just go on to say that as I'm recording this, the shooting in El Paso just took place, as well as the one in Ohio. A local radio guy in Houston, Charles Adams, tweeted out his thoughts on the situation, and I'd like to share part of it. And he's not just a radio personality, he's also a former police officer and a former judge, which I think lends a unique perspective to what he had to say. His tweet, and I'm sorry, I'm probably going to take it out of context, but I'm definitely going to take it out of context. But, that's what you do when you read something that you want to fit your own purposes. You take that shit out of context, right? No. He was talking about what we can do going forward in these mass shootings. But the last part, I feel like applies to marginalized groups like Native Americans and minorities in general. His tweet ends with, quote, "One final thing is certain. It is past time to talk about studies, and it is past time for politicizing the issue. We need to refocus all law enforcement energies wasted on drug prohibition, morality policing, and regressive taxation through citation, immediately into initiatives designed to proactively keeping places where great numbers of Americans congregate safe and searching out these monsters, whether homegrown or foreign-born." End quote. And like I said, he's talking about the mass shooters with the last part, but I love the idea of freeing up the police by not making them sit on the side of the road and write tickets or arresting people over something silly like a little bit of marijuana. We are increasingly becoming more and more of a prison country, and the fact of the matter is, there's too many people being locked up over dumb, victimless crimes. The poor and minorities, Native Americans amongst them, are often victims of these policing tactics. So I don't know, maybe one way to help these communities out is by getting rid of some of these dumb laws that almost seem to target them by nature. Okay, I don't even know if I'm going to keep that whole last segment in. I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about, to be honest with you. I just feel like maybe there's something that could be done to help out those amongst us who didn't historically get such a fair shake in the past few hundred years. And maybe part of that is easing up on stupid laws. Enough of me on my high horse, pretending like I'm some sort of wise person. A wise ass, maybe. I hope I didn't go too hard on Isate, the medicine man known as Coyote Vagina. From what I've read about the man, he just seemed like a con artist. One who would rather make spells than ride into battle. Someone who caused desperate people to commit desperate acts, which resulted in the loss of life. But like I said, the victors write the history. Maybe he was a great man and just remembered wrong. Maybe I'm the asshole by mocking his name. In my defense, it's a fucking hilarious name. Coyote Vagina. Just watch though, there's going to be some new linguistic discovery whereupon it's found out that the name Josh actually means something really embarrassing. Like, he who has penis breath. Or maybe like, he whose brother caught him masturbating to the Oprah Winfrey show when he was 12 and then told everybody in the family about it and they all laughed at him. I don't know, something like that. He would outlive Quanah by a few years, and once Quanah was gone, I read in one source that he tried unsuccessfully to take Quanah's spot as principal chief. I guess, unlike Quanah, he wasn't able to convince the Comanche Nation that he was competent enough for the title. The Comanche Nation is still around, headquartered out of Lawton, Oklahoma. They operate their own housing authority as well as issuing their own tribal vehicle tags. They have their own Department of Higher Education, which helps members in obtaining college degrees. They also own and operate 4 casinos. Ka-ching! White Parker, one of Quanah's sons, would go on to be a Methodist preacher as well as an actor. Another member of the Comanche Nation who became an actor is Gil Birmingham. He's still around and recently portrayed a grieving father in the movie Wind River. Great movie, by the way. The Comanche warrior culture never went away. According to the Comanche Nation's website's veterans page, from 1940 until present, Comanches served in World War II, the Korean, Vietnam, and Persian Gulf Wars, and the War on Terror. 13 Comanche have been killed in action, died of combat wounds, died in captivity, or declared dead while missing in action. Another 46 Comanche have been wounded in combat. 25 Comanche have been decorated for gallantry, heroism, bravery, and valor, and 2 others have found and killed the enemy in hand-to-hand combat. Fuck yeah. 5 Comanche have graduated from 3 of the military academies. 1 has earned general officer status, another the highest warrant officer rank, and 5 others the highest enlisted grade of E9. 82 Comanche women have also served in the military. On behalf of my white ass, just let me go ahead and say thank you to all the Comanche veterans, both alive and dead, who helped preserve my freedom. So what else? Oh, the great military mind of Ronald McKenzie would begin to slip around the same time Quanah started prospering on the reservation. During the Red River War, McKenzie was one of the highest regarded officers in the United States Army, and he continued to shine as an administrator at Fort Sill. He then went on and fought Sioux in northern Cheyenne. Crazy Horse himself surrendered to McKenzie. And McKenzie's mental health was quickly deteriorating. That is a word that I will never, ever be able to say correctly. His mental health was going down the shitter. He was checked into the Bloomingdale Asylum for the Insane in New York City in 1882 and officially declared insane and therefore not fit for duty. His physical and mental health declined to the point where he grew more and more childish until he could no longer make himself understood. He died in a New York hospital on January 18th, 1889 at the age of 48. Just what a sad end to such a brilliant soldier. On a positive note, Quanah was able before his death to meet with many members of his white mother's family. And to this day, both Comanche and white Parker descendants get together every year for a family reunion. So I think that's about it. I don't really have any updates as to previous episodes. Sorry for the length of time between episodes, by the way. In an ideal world, I'd like to release a new episode every week, like say every Monday, but believe it or not, this shit is harder than it sounds. Researching an episode can take several days. I'm obviously reading from like a written script that I typed out, and then I have to edit it down, and then the actual recording process takes me several days. And then another couple of days to edit that down to something that's even remotely worth listening to. And I do have a full-time job. I rarely get 2 days off in a row. And sometimes when I get home from work, I just want to chill and engage in some sort of mindless distraction instead of being productive like I should be doing. I also have a full-time girlfriend. We all know how exhausting that is. Some of her favorite hobbies are having me put together IKEA furniture and then rearranging furniture that's already assembled, along with getting some sort of weird satisfaction just watching me haul up case after case of bottled water up to our second floor apartment. I have a stepdog named Buster who loves to pee on things and bark at squirrels. And a real-life human 19-year-old son. So yeah, I'm busy a little bit. But I'm not so busy that I shouldn't be able to devote a little time each day to this podcast. So that's my goal going forward. Drastically reducing the time it takes to release a new episode. And speaking of my girlfriend, I was joking earlier when I said that she was being racist towards me. She's not racist at all. She's a very lovely lady. And I'm definitely saying this of my own free will. I am not under any duress at all right now. Not worried about a violent repercussion at all. This is totally not a cry for help. She also doesn't just like making me move furniture around. That almost never happens in all honesty. I forgot to mention she's also really into these little midget plants that she got recently. I think they're called supplements. Also, this is episode 6. I'm finally recording on a semi-decent microphone. Thank you all for being patient with the sound quality of this podcast, which has definitely had its ups and downs. Hopefully this one sounds a little bit better than the last, and the next one will sound even better. I don't know what the next topic's going to be. I haven't decided yet. I'm thinking of doing one on the Texas outlaw Sam Bass, or maybe Nate Champion, the badass underdog that took on a corrupt cattle organization, or maybe the mountain man Jim Bridger. I could keep it up on the whole Native American topic and talk about Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce, or I could keep up the Texas history trend and talk about frontiersman Bigfoot Wallace. I don't know if he also had a big dick. He just had big feet. I don't know if there's correlation. Some people say there is. I wear a size 13. I don't know. I've got a long list of topics to pull from, so I won't run out of material anytime soon. If you'd like to suggest a topic, please email me at bloodybeaverpodcast@gmail.com. Also email me if you have any criticisms or complaints. If you're of Comanche descent and you want to tell me what I got wrong, please don't hesitate to do so, and feel free to get on iTunes and rate and review this podcast. That wraps up this episode of Bloody Beaver Podcast. Don't enslave or rape anybody this weekend. Don't kill or torture any babies either. Unless they're super annoying, which is kind of understandable. I'm just kidding. But seriously, how annoying are fucking babies? They can't even wipe their own asses.